What's up, biology students? Mr. Holloway here. In today's video, we're going to talk a bit about cell transport, specifically passive cell transport, which is called passive because it doesn't require any input of energy in order to occur. Before we start talking about cells, I wanted to start with a story about fish. When I was younger, I had an aquarium where I kept freshwater fish like goldfish, guppies, mollies, and the like. Now, if you've ever been to a pet store and walked into the fish section, you've probably noticed that they've got both a freshwater fish section and a saltwater fish section. If you've paid really close attention, you might also notice that many of the saltwater fish are way prettier than the freshwater fish, like the beautiful, brightly colored saltwater fish we see in this picture. Well, one day I was in a pet store buying a new fish for my aquarium, and I overheard this guy talking to the store attendant, asking about the saltwater fish. And she was explaining to him that no, you can't just buy one of these saltwater fish and put it into your freshwater tank because it will die if you do. Won't the fish just evolve? The guy asked. First of all, that's not how evolution works, and we'll learn about that a little bit later in the year. But ignoring that for a second, there is a really good question here. Why can't you put a saltwater fish into a freshwater tank? Understanding the answer to this question will also help you to understand why you can't drink seawater, even if you are stranded on the ocean with nothing else to drink. The answers to these questions have everything to do with cell transport, which is the movement of materials into and out of the cell. Specifically, the reasons you can't drink seawater, and the reason you can't take a fish out of the sea and drop it into a freshwater tank, has to do with passive cell transport, which happens whether we want it to or not, and which happens without requiring any input of energy. Cell transport is regulated by the cell membrane. Every cell is surrounded by a membrane made of a lipid bilayer. But a cell membrane is way more than just lipids. As we can see here, this image of a cell membrane contains a variety of molecules, from proteins to carbohydrates to cholesterols and phospholipids. We refer to this membrane as being selectively permeable, or sometimes we might say that it's semi-permeable, because only certain substances can pass through it while others cannot. Although some forms of cell transport require energy in order to move substances across the membrane, it is fortunate to us that many of the important substances can be moved into and out of our cells by way of passive transport. Passive cell transport includes transport by way of diffusion and osmosis, which you may or may not have heard of before. It all happens because of a concentration gradient, which means that there is a higher concentration of solute or dissolved particles on one side of a membrane than there is on the other. We would say that one side is hypertonic, meaning that it has a higher concentration of solute, and that the other side is hypotonic, meaning it has a lower concentration of solute. All these solute particles, inside and outside of the cells, are moving around all the time, but because there are more of them on the outside of the cell in this figure, that means that more of them will move into the cell than will move out of the cell. This causes the concentration of solute inside of the cell to gradually increase, while the concentration of solute outside of the cell gradually decreases. This happens until the concentration of solute on each side of the membrane is equal, at which point we would say that each side is isotonic compared to the other. Now our cell is in equilibrium, meaning that the rate of particles moving into the cell is equal to the rate of particles moving out, so the concentration remains balanced on both sides. We call this natural movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration diffusion. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported into and out of our cells in this manner. In the case of oxygen and carbon dioxide, these small, non-polar molecules are able to pass directly through the cell membrane. But larger molecules, like glucose, as well as polar molecules like water, have a very difficult time passing through the cell membrane directly. Transport proteins, or protein channels embedded in our cell membrane, help to move these kinds of substances into and out of our cells. We call this kind of diffusion facilitated diffusion because the process is facilitated, or made possible, by the presence of transport proteins. In most cases, the shape of the protein determines what kind of molecules will be transported through that protein, and if a molecule has the wrong shape, it will not be able to fit through the protein channel. Let's see a moving example of how this whole facilitated diffusion thing works. Let's suppose that the top half of this simulation represents the outside of our cell, and the bottom half of this simulation represents the cytoplasm that fills the inside of our cell. In this simulation, we can see that there is a very, very high concentration of this green solute particle outside of the cell, and a very low concentration of this particle on the inside of the cell. We would say that the outside of the cell is hypertonic compared to the cytoplasm inside of our cell, or we could say that the cytoplasm of our cell is hypotonic compared to the outside of the cell. Right now, these solute particles have no way to pass through the membranes because there are no protein channels of the right shape to facilitate the diffusion of these solute particles. However, if we place some protein channels into our simulation, you should see that diffusion begins to occur almost immediately. If you watch closely, you should notice that green solute particles are passing through these channels in both directions, but more of them are being transported into our cells than are being transported out. So the concentration of green particles in the cytoplasm increases, while the concentration of green particles outside of the cell decreases, until eventually both sides have a roughly equal concentration of solute. At which point we would say that we have reached equilibrium, and our cytoplasm is now isotonic compared to the outside of the cell. Now let's add a different solute to the cytoplasm of our cell. This blue particle has no protein channels to pass through, so its concentration inside the cell remains high. But as soon as we put in some appropriate protein channels into our simulation, these blue particles begin to diffuse out of the cell, and the concentration on both sides of the membrane starts to equalize. If we let this simulation run for a while, we will see that both green and blue particles are still moving back and forth across the membrane in both directions, but the movement of particles into the cell is equal to the movement of particles out of the cell. So overall, the concentration of particles doesn't change very much once we reach equilibrium. The movement of water molecules into and out of our cells is an important example of facilitated diffusion because it is quite difficult for water to pass through the nonpolar lipid bilayer that surrounds the cell. We call the movement of water through the cell membrane osmosis, and this happens by way of special proteins called aquaporins, which have just the right shape to allow water molecules to pass freely through them. So far, so good. Stuff moves from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, and we call this movement diffusion. We call a solution hypotonic when it has a lower concentration of solute than our cell has, and hypertonic when our solution has a higher concentration of solute than our cell. When the concentration of solute is equal on both sides of a membrane, we would say that our solution is isotonic. But it gets a little bit more complicated. Suppose that the green solute particles in our figure here cannot pass through the cell membrane, but water can, because this membrane contains aquaporins that allow osmosis to occur. Some of the same basic principles apply, but in this case it will be water that diffuses from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. In this first figure, our cell is placed into a hypotonic solution. So there is a lower concentration of this green solute outside of the cell. But since the green particles cannot pass through the cell membrane out of the cell, the only way to balance out the concentration is for water to diffuse into the cell, diluting the concentration of solute inside. Think of this as like having a higher concentration of water outside of the cell and a lower concentration of water inside of the cell. So water diffuses from high to low, from outside to the inside of our cell. Likewise, if we place our cell into a hypertonic solution, with a higher concentration of solute outside of the cell and a lower concentration of solute inside the cell, then water will diffuse out of the cell to balance out the concentration of solute because the solute itself cannot pass through the cell membrane. This kind of thing happens in our bodies in regards to salt, and water moves into and out of our cells via osmosis, keeping the concentrations of salt and water balanced in and out of our cells. We call this osmoregulation. In these pictures, the small purple particles represent the salt. Since salt cannot pass through the cell membrane via diffusion, at least not very quickly, osmosis causes the net movement of water into the cell, in our first example, and out of the cell in our second example. In both cases, we can see that in the end, the concentration of salt is balanced both in and out of the cell, but that occurred because of osmosis, not because of the diffusion of salt. This is why eating a lot of salty foods makes you thirsty. When you eat all that salty food, the concentration of salt in your blood increases, much like in our second example here. With a higher concentration of salt in your blood than in your cells, water diffuses out of your cells in order to balance out this high salt concentration. That makes us feel thirsty because our cells are losing water. This is also why it's unsafe to drink seawater, which has a much higher concentration of salt than our bodies have naturally. Drinking seawater would actually cause your body to lose water and would only make you more thirsty and more dehydrated in the long run. The balance of salt and water is important for all living organisms, and when cells are in an environment where the concentration of salt is very different than the concentration of salt inside of the cell, then bad things can happen. In extreme cases, cells placed into a hypotonic solution may swell or even burst from the excess of water diffusing into the cell. Likewise, cells may shrivel up when placed into a hypotonic solution. Remember our question about fish at the very beginning? Well, these same basic principles apply to that situation as well. Fish live in the ocean and in freshwater, but very few fish are able to live in both places. Saltwater fish are able to live in saltwater because their cells are in balance with the surrounding seawater, and the cells in our saltwater fish are just as salty as the ocean in which they live. Put that ocean fish into a freshwater environment where the concentration of salt is much lower, and osmosis will cause water to diffuse into that fish's cell to balance out the salt concentration. This throws off the internal chemistry of our fish, who is accustomed to living in salt water, and that fish will die as a result because it cannot maintain homeostasis in this new environment. Likewise, if we put a freshwater fish into the ocean, that fish's cells will suddenly be surrounded by an environment that is much saltier, and water will diffuse out of our fish's cells to balance the concentration and cause the fish to dehydrate and die. This freshwater fish will not be able to maintain homeostasis in a saltwater environment. So, no matter how much you might like to put some of those beautiful saltwater fish into your freshwater aquarium, don't do it. The fish will die as a result of the disruptions to the salt and water balance they are accustomed to, and will only be a waste of your money. Interestingly, there are a few exceptions. Salmon, for example, are born in freshwater rivers, then migrate out to sea where they grow and develop until they reach reproductive age, at which point they swim back to the very same river in which they were born to lay their eggs. But salmon go through a kind of fish puberty that allows them to do this, whereas most fish do not. Remember, diffusion and osmosis occur naturally, and without any input of energy at all, which is why we call this form of cell transport passive cell transport. While this does help our cells to take in certain materials and nutrients like oxygen and glucose, and to expel waste products like carbon dioxide, these same processes can also cause problems if our natural salt and water balance gets thrown way off from what we are used to. For us to maintain homeostasis, maintaining a proper salt and water balance is key. So don't drink seawater, and if you eat a lot of salty foods, remember to drink a lot of water as well to balance it out. And with that, I will bring our video to a close. Thank you for watching, and remember you can go back and watch this video as many times as you need until you feel like you understand what passive cell transport is all about.